Okay, so the presenter in this session is Rebecca Bourhill, and her presentation is entitled Trauma, Memory, and Resilience, South Africa as a Case Study for Trauma and Post-Traumatic Growth. So Rebecca is in her final year of a BA in Psychology and Communication Varsity College, now Emirates, in South Africa. She intends studying further in psychology, living and managing a small farm in the northwest province of South Africa since she was born. Rebecca has been exposed to and has experienced many of South African criminal and illegal activities. She is active on community forums regarding security and protesting illegal mining in the Magaliesburg. She has a keen interest in child development, spectrum disorders, and the impact of trauma. Publications include an article on bullying in individuals with Asperger's, as well as publications in magazines, blogs, and recipe books. So, Rebecca, please take it on.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry, okay. Good evening, everyone. So nice to have so many people here. Sure. Welcome from South Africa. Today, I want to really invite you to a different perspective on post-traumatic growth rather than from a clinical view. I'm going to be approaching it from a lived experience and from a personal experience using stories, academia, a lot of research. A reference list will be available at the end. So I will, sorry, there we go. Right. Trauma, memory, and resilience. South Africa is a case study for trauma and post-traumatic growth. It's 8:30. Time to start winding down before bed. I've been putting off this moment because I know it carries with it anxieties. I go around the house, locking doors and checking the outside gate is closed. I ensure the security beams are charged and armed. I lock the security gate, dividing the living area from the bedrooms, and hang up the keys. My adrenaline is pumping, and my obsessive thinking kicks in. I wonder if the gate is indeed closed. I checked 5 minutes ago. Did I lock the doors? I unlock the security gate and go through to double check. By now it's 9:30. The tiredness I felt earlier has faded, and I wonder how I was going to get to sleep. Our security system includes a series of infrared beams scattered around the house and garden. At 2 in the morning, one of the beams go off. Beep, beep, beep. The distinctive beep pattern informs us that the beam at the cottage has been broken. I listen again. It could have been a false alarm. Beep, beep, beep. The alarm sounds a second time. We let the dogs out. They usually sleep indoors because our neighbors' dogs have been poisoned in the past. A beam alarm sounds again. We now believe somebody is walking around in the garden outside. When the dogs suddenly go crazy, barking viciously, we decide that it is time to call the security company. The alarm beeps again. We activate the old school siren, which is plugged into an outlet in the TV room. 5 minutes later, 3 vehicles surround the house. Shortly thereafter, the security response team calls to say they had not found anything, and if there had been any trespassers, they were now long gone. Back in bed, an hour and a half later, we await the morning to see what had gone down. The next morning, my father and I take the dogs to walk along the boundary fence. Behind the trees, in a dark corner of the garden, we discover a cut in the fence. From top to bottom, the intruders had obviously been frightened off the night before. We fix the fence and debate our future. Weeks later, I make my way out to the laundry to find I can't unlock the security gate. The key is jammed. I walk around the cottage and see that the window burglar bars had been sawn off. The door into the cottage has been forcibly opened. I go inside, careful not to touch anything. The microwave, kettle, and fridge has been stolen. The previous night, while in bed, I had this uneasy feeling, which has now been verified. On this occasion, the would-be burglars had found their way around our security system. We contact the police and wait. They arrive hours later, in the late afternoon. We sit around the dining room table and answer questions while they write up the report by hand. It is a tedious task and tests our patience, but at least we have now got a case number so we can claim from insurance. That night, the beam alarms don't go off, but it does not mean somebody is waiting and watching. My anxiety escalates. I know we need to spend the next couple of weeks figuring out a plan on how to move forward. Do we sell up and move? Do we invest in more security, a new fence, or more lights? Perhaps it's time to invest in cameras. We discuss our options for the next couple of nights. I'm now on high alert. Fortunately, nothing happens, and everything quietens down for the next few weeks. Until one night, the beam alarm goes off again. Will this be a repeat of the events the night before? I've described a couple of our recent experiences on the farm where we live in the northwest province of South Africa. As I pointed out, sometimes when the beams go off, it is a false alarm. Sometimes it is not. We have to constantly stay vigilant. And by using all our resources, we have learned patterns which indicate if somebody may be in the yard. It is also not uncommon to wake up to messages on the community WhatsApp groups, informing us about a robbery close by, a stolen car, a protest taking place on the road into town, or a fatal car accident. There is always a thought if we know the person or people involved. Either way, hearing of these events plants the seed of fear and brings to light past traumas, as well as keeping us in a constant state of fight or flight. They're a constant reminder of the possibility it could be us next. South Africa can be understood as a cumulative trauma environment. Society shaped by colonialism, apartheid, persistent inequality, and ongoing violence, and repeated social and environmental stresses. Colonialism lasted 300 years, where the Dutch and British restructured the economic system and took control over Africa for both political and economic gain. It led to exploitation, land dispossession, racial hierarchies, identity shifting, forced labor systems, loss of indigenous knowledge and culture, as well as segregation. It preceded and laid the groundwork for apartheid. Apartheid was a period between 1948 and 1994, where government strictly enforced laws to promote political, social, and economic segregation among different racial groups. These laws ensured white supremacy. Black South Africans had to carry ID documents, identification documents, and had limited freedom to movement. There was also a segregation of living spaces, public facilities, and unequal access to resources. Black South Africans had to live outside of main towns or cities, in townships, making for long commutes to work. Laws also prevented them from receiving standard education and refused them from attending universities. The laws may have succeeded in maintaining segregation and minimizing contact between racial groups, but the consequences of this time remain: deep-seated inequalities, violence, racial tensions, xenophobia, and oppression. After the transition to democracy in 1994, it was hoped the inequalities of the past would be negotiated and eventually disappear. However, the divide between the middle class and those in poverty remain, as does identity struggles, violence, substance abuse, and gender-based violence, to name a few. Narratives from colonial and apartheid eras remain and continue to be filtered through to younger generations. Stories and narratives have been passed down through the generations within communities, and internalized oppression has become a major issue of the youth of today. Although the trauma of apartheid is over, its legacy lives on. The high levels of poverty, violence, including murder, substance abuse, gender-based violence, and adverse childhood experiences contribute to the elevated rates of mental health challenges. South Africa's public healthcare system is broken, and for those needing care, can wait for days before they're attended to. Furthermore, funds allocated to mental health care are insufficient to deal with the large volume of patients. There is also a huge shortage of specialists who deal with mental health issues. For those who can afford it, the private healthcare system is available, but at a very high cost. Trauma in South Africa has been widely documented and has traditionally focused on the negative psychological and physical consequences, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic illness, and in extreme cases, death. While work on the consequences of trauma are essential, it provides only a partial understanding of the human responses to adversity. A growing body of literature introduces an alternative perspective. In 1996, Tedeschi and Calhoun conceptualized the phenomenon of post-traumatic growth, the positive psychological change that can emerge through the struggle with perceived trauma. Importantly, PTG does not negate suffering. Rather, it coexists with it. Significant gaps remain in understanding the prevalence of PTG in South Africa, as well as the role of culture and community. This raises a critical question. Should post-traumatic growth be understood not only as an individual process, but as something fundamentally collective? As I speak to you today, I want to cover three primary objectives: to examine the relationship between trauma and post-traumatic growth, apply this to the South African context and the relevance of it here, and lastly, explore the role of community support and cultural values in facilitating post-traumatic growth. At this point, I'll propose to you the South African concept of Ubuntu, translated as I am because we are, which aligns with post-traumatic growth as it can be understood as a foundation to collective growth and healing. Although we are here to discuss PTG, it's important to clarify the concept of trauma. As we know, It is the result of an overwhelming amount of stress, which exceeds our ability to cope with the emotions associated with a series of events or an event. Trauma is severely distressing and can include experiences such as losing a pet, a relational breakup, to a life-threatening event, violence, war, neglect, poverty, severe harm, or the personal example I read above, to name a few. Trauma can occur indirectly through stories from other community members and through intergenerational transmission. These are both very common ways trauma is experienced here. Although it is a universal experience, the interpretation of it is highly subjective and based on the individual. Culture, history, and context impact the interpretation of it, and therefore how meaning is constructed. Culture brings individuals together, whereby the group has a shared set of norms, values, beliefs, symbols, and behaviors, which are learned from an early age. This will influence the way in which the group perceives, experiences, and expresses their trauma, giving a shared sense of understanding and interpretation of the world around them. Cultural scripts guide individuals' beliefs, values, behaviors, and expectations. This will therefore influence our concept of trauma and mental illness, and what one culture may see as a mental illness, while another considers it part of daily life, such as poverty. It is also these cultural scripts which influence how people within that community may respond to trauma. Trauma is a social construct, evolving and dynamic, closely linked to context and culture. The current socio-economic state of South Africa, with high poverty rates, poor living conditions, and severe inequalities, will influence the way trauma is interpreted. For Black South African people, their relationship to their land, environment, village, elders, and ancestors is an integral part of their identity, relationships, history, culture, and day-to-day functioning. Interruption to these relationships can be deeply traumatizing. Mindy Fully Love calls this severing from land, nation, neighborhood, and homes root shock. She defines this as a traumatic stress reaction to the destruction of all or part of one's emotional network. Root shock involves the breaking of spiritual, emotional, social, and economic bonds, which results in violence, loss of wisdom, as well as culture and historical memory. An African proverb once said, "Cut your chains and you are free. Cut your roots and you die." Due to the daily struggles many people face in the townships, as well as unequal power struggles, the perception of trauma will be significantly different between cultures, even within the same country. It is for this reason I will be focusing on personal experience, as well as stories from my community. I cannot speak for those who live in townships, nor for those who live in fancy houses, sitting on their porch, watching the sun go down, sipping on champagne. When looking at the South African population, it becomes clear that many people have been forced to learn the skill of resilience. For many of us, resilience is not just a personal strength, but a survival skill. It refers to the ability to return to one's baseline of functionality after adversity and trauma. When I heard the concept of post-traumatic growth, I began to think if it is possible that what we are experiencing here as South Africans is more than resilience, but also a form of PTG and thriving. Post-traumatic growth is a transformative process where individuals experience positive psychological growth as a result of a struggle with a perceived traumatic event or events. It is important to note here that PTSD and distress can co-occur with post-traumatic growth. This would be common amongst the South African population with our extremely high prevalence of PTSD. As with trauma, PTG is a universal experience, but the way it is expressed is subjective and culture dependent. Part of the reason for this is that different cultures define, explain, or interpret the term trauma differently. This, along with whether a culture is individualistic or collectivist, would also explain why cultures respond differently to trauma. There are 5 areas or domains in which individuals can grow. The same domains can be applied to collective post-traumatic growth. The first involves developing deeper and more meaningful relationships with others. Following trauma, individuals may become more emotionally open, compassionate, and willing to share their experiences. This growth often occurs through conversations with family, communities, and fellow survivors rather than solely within therapy. In South African context, neighbors may gather around a braai or barbecue after a traumatic event to debrief and discuss how to move forward. During these conversations, people often discover shared experiences of crime and insecurity, creating a shared sense of trust, understanding, and solidarity. Because many security measures and professional psychological support are financially inaccessible, communities frequently rely on one another for emotional and practical support. Through shared hardship, trauma can strengthen relationships and foster collective resilience. The second domain is increased personal strength, or in a more broad context, collective strength. Initially, survival is often the primary focus following trauma. Over time, however, individuals may become aware of an inner resilience and strength they were not previously aware of. This process occurs gradually as people and community rebuild their beliefs, confidence, and sense of identity. In collective settings, particularly amongst groups affected by oppression and historical trauma, this strength may emerge through activism and social movements. In South Africa, movements such as Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall can be understood as examples of post-traumatic growth, emerging from the intergenerational effects of apartheid and colonialism. These movements reflected young students' refusal to remain passive recipients of historical trauma. Instead, students mobilized to challenge ongoing inequality, marginalization, and exclusion within higher education and broader society. These movements demonstrate how adversity can foster collective resilience, solidarity, and purpose, and a stronger sense of community. Rather than trauma leading to only suffering, it can also contribute to empowerment and social action. Trauma often involves some form of loss, but this can also create space for new possibilities. Individuals may begin pursuing ways of living they would not previously have considered. In South Africa, many people contemplate immigrating, either due to the country's ongoing challenges, such as crime, poor infrastructure, and instability, or following a life-threatening event that prompts them to reconsider their future. Those who immigrate often leave behind established support systems and enter unfamiliar environments where they are forced to rebuild their lives. While this transition may initially create further stress and isolation, some individuals ultimately develop greater resilience, independence, and appreciation for opportunities that emerge. My own family reflects this experience. I now have relatives living in England, Portugal, Australia, and America. My cousins were encouraged by their parents to immigrate after their grandfather was shot and killed during a barbecue at his home. Although migration brought significant challenges, they have eventually established stable and fulfilling lives abroad. Their experiences demonstrate how trauma can lead individuals towards entirely new possibilities and identities that may not otherwise have emerged. Life-threatening and life-changing traumatic events often force us to confront our own mortality, which can lead to a greater appreciation for life. Following trauma, ordinary aspects of daily living may take on new meaning and significance. Living on a farm in South Africa brings a constant awareness of the fragility of life, shaped both by personal experiences and by hearing the stories of others. It is not uncommon to wake up to messages on community forums reporting a farm attack somewhere in the country. These incidents serve as continual reminders of the risks associated with farm life, but also appreciate life for what it has to offer. Families often face difficult decisions regarding whether to stay or leave. For many, leaving is not simple. The farm we live on has been in our family for over 70 years, making the idea of leaving emotionally complex. The final domain proposed by Tedeschi and Calhoun is spiritual and existential change. Trauma often leads individuals to question meaning, purpose, faith, and mortality. In cases involving violence, physical harm, or loss, these questions may also center around forgiveness and spirituality. In many South African communities, traumatic experiences are processed through spiritual and religious practices. Following farm attacks and violence, individuals may turn to their faith to cope with fear, grief, and forgiveness. Similarly, many Black South African communities incorporate singing and dancing into mourning rituals as a way of honoring and celebrating the lives of lost loved ones. Ancestors are also considered active members of the community who guide and protect, whereby healing occurs through communication, rituals, and symbolic practices with these ancestors. Following significant life events, many people, myself included, are often drawn towards spiritual spaces as places of support, reflection, and connection. In many cases, this movement towards spirituality does not occur immediately after trauma, but gradually, over time, as individuals search for ways to process difficult experiences. For me personally, retreat centers have become important spaces for healing and reflection, following challenging experiences at school and repeated break-ins while growing up. I may just add here that our fence has been cut 40 times, plus minus, in the last 15 years. Through meditation and spiritual practices, I began seeking not only safety and coping mechanisms, but also a deeper sense of connection with myself and with others. Over time, these experiences contributed to personal growth, self-understanding, and a renewed sense of meaning that I may not have discovered without those earlier struggles. In the context of collective and historical violence, the effects of trauma are felt throughout the country. South Africa makes for an interesting case study for observing collective trauma and post-traumatic growth, as we have both ends of a very wide spectrum, the very rich and the very poor. There is one term which attempts to unite individuals throughout the country: Ubuntu. This is where I will focus on for the last few minutes of this discussion. Ubuntu is an African term which defines togetherness within humanity, or I am because we are. One cannot be without another. The concept is about building relationships, regardless of race, gender, class, or power. Trauma can result in feelings of disconnection and isolation. Ubuntu emphasizes the importance of relationships and bringing the community together to process trauma. It emphasizes that everyone has a role to play in the community, where individuals are not only supported professionally, but also by peers. As I have mentioned, connecting with others and sharing stories provides an opportunity to help build trust and a sense of belonging. By using the Ubuntu philosophy to build relationships following trauma, one can foster empathy and compassion. This creates a shared sense of humanity, which can be incredibly healing and empowering. The Ubuntu philosophy promotes collective healing, especially when a community experiences a trauma collectively, such as natural disasters, poverty, xenophobia, violence, or oppression. It encourages healing, whereby individuals can create a safe space for open dialogue and mutual support, assisting the community to recover collectively. When the philosophy of Ubuntu is neglected, it can cause rage, fragmentation, community disintegration, a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. The impact can be felt for generations, and it is reflected in the country's high levels of violence and fragmented families. Therefore, Ubuntu fits within the post-traumatic growth framework because both emphasize transformation through relationships, meaning-making, and collective support. Ubuntu aligns specifically with the relational aspects of post-traumatic growth dimensions and, in fact, acts as a support to moving towards and maintaining growth beyond the individual level onto a collective one. It focuses on coping strategies, activism, religious gatherings, and mutual support after a traumatic event. During my research on this topic, it has become clear that indeed our resiliency does contribute to bouncing back, but it does also help us to move forward as a country and as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was illuminating.